Why are more kids turning away from religion? Simple, they're growing up with Google, not gospel. When a 13-year-old can fact-check Bible stories with a 10-second search, old answers don't cut it anymore. They're learning about evolution in science class, then being told Adam and Eve were real people. Those stories don't match. One kid watches a documentary on black holes, then hears about a talking snake in church. You can guess which one sounds more believable. They're seeing how sacred texts justify slavery, sexism, even violence, and asking, why would a loving God allow that? And let's be real, miracles that supposedly happened thousands of years ago? No phone footage, no evidence, just stories. It's not just doubt, it's critical thinking. They're not being disrespectful, they're being honest. Many still believe in something bigger, but it's not always the version written down centuries ago. For this generation, blind faith isn't noble, it's confusing. They want answers, not just traditions. And that's why more and more, the next generation isn't rejecting God. They're just rethinking what belief even means. In this video, we're breaking down why more and more kids today just aren't buying into religion like past generations did. We'll dive into the big questions they're asking, the stuff that doesn't add up anymore. From ancient stories that clash with modern science, to contradictions in sacred texts, to the lack of evidence behind so-called miracles. Today's youth are looking for logic, not just tradition. It's not about being rebellious. It's about making sense of the world they live in. With so much information at their fingertips, it's getting harder to take things on faith alone. So let's explore the reasons why belief is shifting and why for many kids, religion just doesn't hold up the way it used to. Contradiction within Bible. A child at Sunday school once asked, if God forbids killing, why encourage genocide in the Old Testament? The teacher replied it was allegory, but the child's doubt had already taken root. Each of these contradictions challenges literal interpretations and encourages younger minds to question inconsistencies. The Bible is often presented as the perfect, divinely inspired Word of God. But when you start reading closely, the contradictions inside start to raise serious questions. And for a generation raised on fact-checking, those inconsistencies are hard to ignore. Take this one, for example. Exodus 20 verse 13 clearly says, "You shall not kill." It's one of the 10 commandments, supposedly non-negotiable. But then in 1 Samuel 15 verse 3, God tells Saul to wipe out an entire population. Men, women, children, even infants. That's not just killing, that's genocide. So which is it? Don't kill, or kill when God says so. That contradiction alone makes a lot of kids stop and say, wait, what? Or look at family values in the New Testament. In Matthew 15 verse 4, Jesus repeats the commandment, honor your father and mother. Seems straightforward. But then in Luke 14 verse 26, Jesus says that anyone who wants to follow him must hate their father and mother, even their own life. That's a total reversal. Try explaining that to a teenager raised to value loyalty and respect. Which version of Jesus are we supposed to believe? And then there's the story of Peter denying Jesus. All 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, tell it, but the details don't match. Mark says the rooster crows twice before the 3rd denial. The others say it crows once. If these accounts are all supposed to be eyewitness testimonies of the same event, how do you explain that kind of mix-up? For a kid growing up in the age of cameras and screenshots, inconsistent storytelling raises red flags. Here's a real-life example. A Sunday school teacher once told a group of 10-year-olds the story of Saul's divine orders to kill an entire city. One curious kid raised their hand and asked, if God says not to kill, why did he tell Saul to do exactly that? The teacher paused, then said, it's allegory, not meant to be taken literally. But the doubt was already planted. The child might not have had all the words to explain it yet, but they knew something didn't sit right. Each of these contradictions challenges a literal, unquestioning interpretation of the Bible. And kids today, they don't just shrug it off. They Google, they cross-reference, they talk. And when they see these inconsistencies, it shakes the foundation of belief that used to go unchallenged. If God is truly omniscient, meaning all-knowing, then how can there be contradictions in the books that are claimed to be his word? That raises a serious question. An all-knowing, perfect being wouldn't make mistakes, overlook details, or contradict himself. So, if we're finding inconsistencies in sacred texts, we have to ask, are those really coming from an omniscient source? It just doesn't add up that a divine message, meant to guide people for all time, would contain conflicting statements or unclear teachings. Something's off there. So, we're really left with two options. Either God isn't actually omniscient, which would go against what most major religions teach, or these books, at least in part, weren't directly authored or perfectly preserved by him. Maybe human error, interpretation, or even manipulation played a role over time. It's not an easy thing to consider, especially for people raised with deep faith in these scriptures. But if we're being honest and looking at it critically, the presence of contradictions forces us to reevaluate where these texts really come from, and how much of them, if any, are truly divine in origin. For a generation that values consistency, fairness, and evidence, contradictions like these don't just feel confusing, they feel dishonest. And that's exactly why so many young people are stepping away from traditional religion and asking bigger, tougher questions. Lack of historical evidence for Jesus. Jesus may have existed, but the actual historical evidence is surprisingly thin. Outside of the Bible, there are only a handful of references to him, and most of them are secondhand, vague, or written decades, sometimes nearly a century, after his supposed lifetime. Take Tacitus, for example. He was a respected Roman historian, and he does mention Jesus being executed under Pontius Pilate. But here's the catch. Tacitus was writing around 116 AD, almost 80 to 90 years after Jesus' death, and there's no clear sign he had access to first-hand sources. It reads more like he's repeating what Christians believed at the time than reporting historical fact. Then there's Josephus, a Jewish historian from the 1st century. His book Antiquities of the Jews includes 2 short references to Jesus, but scholars have long debated their authenticity, especially the famous Testimonium Flavianum. That one talks about Jesus as the Messiah and mentions his resurrection, which feels way too Christian in tone for a Jewish writer. Most experts agree parts of that passage were likely edited or added by Christian scribes later on. Scholar Bart Ehrman, in Jesus, Apocalyptic Prophet of the New Millennium, breaks this down and points out that while Jesus probably existed as a historical figure, much of what we know about him was shaped by early church agendas. You also have more modern analytical tools, like a statistical study on name frequencies in the Gospels and Acts. Yes, the names used in these books match those common in Judea during that time. But just because the names fit the time period doesn't mean the events happened. It's like writing a story set in 1960s Chicago and using names like Mike and Linda. Believable names, sure, but it doesn't prove the story's real. One university student once did a fascinating project interviewing elderly residents in rural villages around the Middle East, asking if their families had ever passed down stories of Jesus performing miracles or rising from the dead. The answer? Silence. Nothing. No oral tradition. That speaks volumes. It suggests that the early stories of Jesus likely developed decades later, passed down orally, and only later written down by the gospel authors, each with their own take and agenda. Elaine Pagels, in her book Beyond Belief, argues that the gospel writers weren't aiming to write history. They were shaping theology. Their goal wasn't to document events as they happened, but to craft a version of Jesus that fit their community's beliefs and needs. That's why we get 4 Gospels that tell the same general story but differ in major details, because they weren't eyewitness reports. They were narratives designed to inspire faith, not record fact. Miracles, verifiable fact or myth. Miracles are at the heart of Christian belief. Feeding 5,000 people with a few loaves and fish, walking on water, healing the blind, even raising the dead. These are powerful stories that have inspired generations. But here's the tough question. How do you actually verify a miracle? Unlike modern events where we have video, photos, or news reports, none of these supernatural moments were recorded by anyone outside the gospel writers. There's no Roman official writing, "Oh yeah, saw Jesus stroll across the Sea of Galilee today." Not even a casual mention from townspeople. For something so dramatic, you'd expect some buzz in the historical record, but it's radio silence. What makes it more interesting is that many of these miracle themes didn't start with Christianity. Ancient myths from Egypt and Persia tell similar stories. Horus, the Egyptian god, was said to have healed the sick and even raised people from the dead. Mitra, a Persian deity, had a virgin birth and performed wonders. Dionysus turned water into wine long before Jesus did. Scholar Reza Aslan, in Zealot, The Life and Times of Jesus of Nazareth, points out that the Gospels were written in a religious landscape already full of miracle stories. It's possible early Christians adapted those familiar motifs to make Jesus' life more compelling to the audience of the time. Even today, we hear people claiming modern miracles, especially in tight-knit faith communities. I once visited a nursing home where residents talked about people being healed through prayer. One woman swore her arthritis vanished after a church service. But when you check the medical records, most of these cases involve regular treatment, gradual improvement, or no actual documentation of the miracle. Scholars call this confirmation bias, when people remember what fits their beliefs and forget the rest. Elaine Pagels, in the Gnostic Gospels, argues that miracle stories in the New Testament weren't just reports. They were crafted responses to the fears and hopes of early Christian communities struggling under Roman persecution and social unrest. So, when we ask how to verify miracles logically, we're really asking, are these stories meant to be literal history, or symbolic tools meant to build faith and offer hope? And for a generation raised on evidence and critical thinking, the lack of outside confirmation makes it harder to just take these stories at face value. Cosmology, creation, and superstitions. A teacher showed a fossil trilobite, dated 500 million years ago, to a student who had believed in six-day creation. The student paused, then quietly said, "Maybe it's a metaphor." Logical reflection. Accepting ancient cosmology as literal truth without reconciling with modern knowledge pushes young minds towards secularism. Genesis tells us God created humans in 6 days, and it describes heaven as being up above the sky and hell as a fiery place below the earth. Sounds pretty clear, right? But here's the thing. This was written by people living thousands of years ago, in a time when their understanding of the world was totally different from ours. Back then, folks believed in a flat earth with a solid dome, called the firmament, holding back the waters above. Heaven wasn't just some abstract spiritual place. It was literally up there in the sky. Hell, well, it was thought to be underground, a fiery pit beneath our feet. This kind of cosmology fits the tribal, pre-Copernican worldview where the sun, moon, and stars all circled around a stationary Earth. Scholar John Walton, in his book The Lost World of Genesis 1, explains how ancient Near Eastern cultures shared similar ideas about the universe, and that the Bible reflects that cultural mindset rather than modern science. Today, we've sent satellites into space, walked on the moon, and drilled deep into the Earth's crust, and there's no sign of a firmament or a literal fiery hell underground. If God is truly omnipotent, meaning all-powerful, then it doesn't really make sense to limit creation to a time frame like 6 days. An all-powerful being wouldn't necessarily need time at all. The idea of counting days for the creation of the universe feels more symbolic than literal. It could have been a way for ancient people to understand the process in a way that made sense to them at the time. But from a modern, scientific point of view, the universe forming in just 6 literal days doesn't line up with what we know about physics, astronomy. It's possible that God, if you believe in a divine creator, could have set up something far more complex, like a kind of cosmic program or system that runs itself. Think of it like installing software that then develops and expands on its own, following certain rules. That's actually closer to how science explains the development of the universe, through natural laws, systems, and processes over billions of years. So maybe the six-day creation story isn't meant to be taken as a historical event, but more as a metaphor to help people understand the bigger picture in simpler terms. Crusades, violence, and hypocrisy. Christianity preaches love, forgiveness, and peace, right? That's the message you hear from the pulpit and see in the Gospels. But when you look back through history, things get a lot more complicated. The Crusades are a prime example. 6 brutal centuries of warfare fought in the name of Christ. These weren't just battles between armies. They involved mass slaughter of Jews and even Christians deemed heretics. Historian Thomas S. Bridge, in his book The Crusades, The War for the Holy Land, details how these wars were marked by extreme violence and intolerance, a sharp contrast to the love your neighbor teaching Jesus gave. It's hard to square that kind of bloodshed with the idea of a loving God. What's more, religious institutions often didn't just stay spiritual. They got tangled up with political power, using their claimed divine authority to justify conquest and control over people. The church wasn't just a place of worship. It was a political force that shaped kings and empires. Scholar Karen Armstrong, in Fields of Blood, Religion and the History of Violence, argues that religion, including Christianity, has often been used to legitimize violence and domination. I remember a college trip to Jerusalem where we had a chance to talk with a Middle East historian. He asked a question that really stuck with me. How many innocent Christians today would be willing to tolerate other faiths if the Crusades had never happened? History casts a long shadow, and the legacy of those wars still influences how people view religion and conflict today. Superstitions, relics, and dogma. Christianity today is full of relics, holy objects, and rituals that often look a lot more like superstition than actual faith. Think about relic worship. Pieces of the true cross, saints' bones, or even cloth said to have healing powers. Then there's the spectacle of exorcisms and those big televangelist healing services where pastors wave hands and pray for miraculous cures. Scholar Michael Shermer, in his book The Believing Brain, points out that many of these practices have deep roots in ancient pagan traditions, borrowed and adapted over centuries. These rituals aren't really about reasoned theology or evidence. They're designed to tap into emotions, hope, and sometimes fear. I remember watching a televangelist rally where a man was absolutely convinced a handkerchief blessed by the pastor had cured his cancer. He shared his story with tears, saying it was a miracle. But when medical records came out later, doctors said his remission was likely spontaneous, something that occasionally happens without treatment. Yet, that didn't shake the man's belief. It only seemed to strengthen it. This is what psychologist Richard Wiseman discusses in Paranormality: how people cling to emotional experiences even when the facts don't support them. These traditions persist because they feel powerful and personal, not because they're backed by verifiable proof. And for many young people raised on science and critical thinking, this kind of faith just doesn't add up. The moral cost and next generation. More and more young people are asking, why should I trust a system full of moral contradictions, unverifiable claims, and fear-based authority? When kids first dive into the Bible or religious teachings, they often come across violent commands, conflicting stories, and miracles that can't be proven. It's no surprise many start searching for answers that actually make sense. They turn to science, which offers testable evidence, or ethics based on humanism and social justice. Focusing on fairness and compassion, philosopher Daniel Dennett, in his book Breaking the Spell, argues that religion should be open to scrutiny and that faith without evidence is becoming less convincing for a generation raised on critical thinking. Conclusion and call to action. A religion created by a man can't truly be the religion of the entire universe. If a belief system comes from a specific region, shaped by the culture, time, and language of that area, how can it claim to speak for all of humankind? Something so rooted in one place can't reflect the needs, experiences, or truths of people everywhere. A religion that defines how someone should live their personal life down to the smallest detail might work for some, but it can't be universal. That's why many of these prophetic religions don't fully align with logic, science, or the idea of a common good that applies equally to all people. If God is truly omnipresent, omniscient, omnipotent, merciful, and just, then there are some hard questions to consider. Why would such a God need a messenger at all? Why communicate through one person or one book, especially if that book contains contradictions? And how could a truly merciful and just God allow violence like the Crusades to happen in his name? That doesn't sound divine, it sounds human. French writer Louis Jacaliot pointed out in the Bible in India that many core concepts found in prophetic religions seem to have been borrowed from much older Eastern philosophies. If that's true, it challenges the idea that these religions are entirely original or divinely revealed. If your kids are starting to question faith, they're not lost, they're thinking. They're noticing contradictions in holy books, the lack of solid evidence, the dark parts of history, and how superstition doesn't line up with reason. Here on this channel, we're not just questioning old beliefs. We're uncovering a deeper truth that existed long before the rise of organized religion like Christianity. We stand for logic, reason, and science-backed understanding. A system that actually answers your kids' questions without fear, guilt, or blind faith. This is the path that won't leave them confused, agnostic, or walking away from belief altogether. So if you're tired of contradictions and want something your family can truly understand and trust, stay with us. We're here to guide you through the facts, the logic, and the bigger picture that makes sense. This isn't an attack on people of faith, it's an invitation. Let's move from blind belief to honest questioning. Let's raise the next generation to value critical thinking over blind trust, curiosity over dogma. Make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss a video. Got questions? Drop them in the comments. We answer everything with honesty and clarity. Share this with your kids, your friends, and anyone ready to leave behind superstition and walk toward truth. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.